So I'd like to ask a very simple question in my talk, and the question is chemical evolution Darwinian? This is not a scientific talk. This is a philosopher's science talk, and I'm working on the concept here of chemical evolution. It's a work in progress, so I welcome any feedback that you might have. It's one of the questions that I'm typically asking as a philosopher of science, alongside other questions on, for instance, the role of explanation. What is a scientific explanation? The role of models in science, so far as they may explain something. I'm also working on inter-theoretical reduction, how different theories are linked to one another. So here, it's a talk that has to do with a concept. The concept of chemical evolution, and it's linked to Darwin's evolution by natural selection. So, as you may know, I mean, this question is also a question that has a parallel question in biology. And in biology, the question is biological evolution Darwinian? Okay, that may strike you as like an obvious question, right? Yes, of course it's Darwinian. This is the only theory that we know about biological evolution. But is it so? Actually, it's not that easy. There is a huge debate, there has been and still is, a very big debate in biology about whether biological evolution is indeed Darwinian. And this debate is called the debate about adaptationism. Right? Is biological evolution Darwinian? That means typically, it's about asking whether the traits of organisms result of evolution by natural selection and only of evolution by natural selection. That's to say, the traits of organisms are only produced by evolution by natural selection and not by something else. And of course, this is a debate that has typically opposed pro-adaptationists like Dawkins and Dennett against anti-adaptationists like Good and Leontine, and many other people advocating the place, some room for other evolutionary processes inside biological evolution other than natural selection. And typically, the view that we now have about biological evolution tends to be that yes, in biological evolution, evolution by natural selection is indeed very important, matters a lot, but there are other mechanisms by which populations of organisms may evolve, and that includes random drift, including migration processes, developmental processes also that may have an impact on evolutionary processes, and epigenetics. Right? So the picture is much more complex than that in biology. And so the question I'd like to ask is, actually, which role does evolution by natural selection play in chemical evolution, if any? First, what is chemical evolution? People use this term. We can mean two different things. First, it's simply a description of change. Things evolve, and we tell a story. We tell a story somehow like Buffon natural history, just telling how things have evolved, how things have changed. And in this case, we can use the concept of chemical evolution simply as meaning, well, this is the history of what happened up until there was some form of life. But sometimes we mean more than that when using chemical evolution. We mean a theory of change, somehow like the evolutionary theory that was proposed by Darwin. Darwin is not saying how things have evolved from a biological perspective, but is proposing a theory of biological change. And it's something similar. I mean, chemical evolution is sometimes used with this meaning. It has the meaning of being able to explain change for chemical entities, about chemical entities, and before typically the appearance of life. So the concept, I've chosen the name chemical evolution, but you may have heard of other concepts that refer more or less to the same things. This might be the case of prebiotic evolution, biogenesis, abiogenesis, molecular evolution, And so there are different terms in the literature being used and that covers somehow, that has the same meaning as chemical evolution in the sense that I'm taking it here. Typically, chemical evolution aims at explaining, so the formation of, we're talking about chemicals, so chemicals and chemical entities of various degrees of complexity, typically on Earth, but also elsewhere in the universe, and in particular, but I insist also, not exclusively, before the appearance of systems that we could call living. There are numerous references to this concept in the literature and different meanings. I've just listed a few here. But one of the key, I said, maybe not proponents, but thinkers recently about chemical evolution is, I like to quote Melvin Calvin, who in the 1950s, 60s, talked about chemical evolution specifically, and specifically also with a view to understanding it as some form of Darwinian evolution in the chemical world. And I found this is particularly interesting. But before that, obviously, there are numerous other references to the concept of chemical evolution. We find it in works from O'Brien, a British biochemist, Benjamin Moore, also mentions it in 1912 in a book, The Origin and Nature of Life. A French biologist, Félix de Dantec, mentions also something like this at the end of the 19th century. And, of course, the big evolutionary thinker Herbert Spencer mentioned it in the Principles of Biology, just a little bit after Darwin, publications of the Origins of Species in 1859. So the question is that I like to ask first is, what is really chemical evolution when we understand it as a theory of change? And therefore, what are the evolutionary processes that are subsumed under the label chemical evolution? So I mentioned Melvin Calvin, and one of the simple or first answers to this type of question is to say, well, when we use chemical evolution, we mean chemical evolution as evolution by natural selection in the chemical world, and typically the chemical world that preceded the living world that we know. So what Calvin is doing is simply saying, well, like, I'm taking Darwin's evolution by natural selection, and I'm transposing it to the prebiotic inanimate chemical world. So he specifically says that chemical evolution is a process of random variation, autocatalysis, and selection. And it's about the same type of meaning that we find in papers, for instance, from Eigen and Schuster and others after Melvin Calvin. So if we try to understand his thoughts, Calvin's thoughts a bit more precisely, we can try to look at two things and ask ourselves, what is it that evolves according to Calvin? So we're going to have a talk about what are the units of evolution in this chemical evolution, and second, what are the processes of evolution or the evolutionary processes? This is also something typical a typical way of understanding biological evolution. So looking at the units of evolution and the processes that make these units evolve. And so according to Calvin, we have, on the one hand, the biological systems as units of evolutions, and on the other, we have non-biological systems. And so biological systems evolve by biological evolution, non-biological systems, this is chemical evolution. But according to Calvin's view, it's the same process that drives chemical evolution and biological evolution. It's a process of natural selection. So some set of variation, some form of reproduction or self-replication, and some form of selection. Right? Now, the only difference between chemical evolution and biological evolution in this case is the fact that there is a life cutoff. Right? So chemical evolution deals with non-biological systems that are not alive, and biological evolution deals with systems that are alive. But what makes all these systems evolve, it's the same process. It's Darwin, evolution by natural selection. Now, there are, as you know, many divergences on the life cutoff somehow. So here I've just mentioned a quote from Gerald Joyce, but we find the view also in Christian de Duve and others. Here the quote says, once a general mechanism existed for self-replication, allowing the introduction of variation and the ability to replicate those variants, Darwinian evolution began to operate. Fine, so there is Darwinian evolution there, but this marked the beginning of life. So according to several scientists, as soon as we have Darwinian evolution by natural selection, we have life, right? And this is, you can feel there is a tension here with the view proposed by Melvin Calvin. If we try to reconstruct the Joyce or the Duve view, if we have also units of evolution, evolutionary processes here, we have two kinds of systems, biological systems that are alive and non-biological systems that are not alive. But natural selection only deals with biological systems, because as soon as you have evolution by natural selection, you have life, according to this scientist. So chemical evolution must be something different. So what they have in mind typically is, well, it's some form of chemistry, and just chemistry, but not evolution by natural selection. So there are different types of chemical processes here. Then as soon as in these chemical processes we have some form of replication plus some form of heredity, so it's variation, and some form of selection, then you have natural selection, and then you have life. All right? So the question is, are we happy with this view, or are we more happy with Calvin's view in the sense of which view corresponds better to what we're thinking now about the origins of life? So if we compare the two options, definitely Calvin's view here, right, when we ask the question, is chemical evolution Darwinian, the answer would be yes, according to Calvin, but according to people like Joyce and Duve, it would be no here. But as I tried to mention, we have divergences as to where the life cutoff is, and this, for instance, can be seen in terms of where we would place the RNA world according to this option 1 or option 2. And the RNA world will be put in different places. Definitely for Calvin, that would not be alive. And the RNA world would necessitate a lot of evolution by natural selection. Whereas in this view here, the RNA world would already be life. So the question we can ask is, for instance, can we have an RNA world without evolution by natural selection? So, or in a way, is even the hypothesis of an RNA world in need of some form of evolution by natural selection as in terms of explaining its appearance? I would say, yes, we do need some form of evolution by natural selection to account for the presence of an RNA world, even at this stage. And I think there are two arguments. The first one is that if we take a ribozyme that's about 200 nucleotides long, as you know, the probability of a random synthesis of a very good ribozyme, like a replicase that we heard about this morning, that's close to null, basically. It's 10 to the minus 120. On the other hand, the probability that we randomly synthesize a very weak ribozyme is more, it's much better, and this is what is done in the laboratory. But what they've done also in the laboratory is, in order to get to very strong ribozymes, basically, they take some of the weak ones, more or less synthesized randomly, and then they evolve it in vitro. Okay, so what we see is that from lab experiment, in vitro evolution shows that it's an extremely effective way to get to a strong ribozyme, and therefore evolution by natural selection could be a very plausible explanation of the origin of an RNA world, right? But we need somehow evolution by natural selection in order to get to the RNA world. Another reason, I think, is that because we have so many divergences of the life cutoff, I mentioned the RNA world, but there are many other polemic subjects like cross-catalytic networks. Are they alive, not alive? Not going to review the pros and cons. Same thing about self-replicating liposomes of the lipid world. Same question about viruses. Same question about some very tiny symbiotic microorganisms. There's plenty of stuff that now we find for which there is debate as to whether these things are alive or not. And I would argue that these things clearly show that in between stuff that is clearly not alive and stuff that is clearly alive, life comes as some forms of shades of gray, right? There is stuff that is more or less alive, and I guess we should become more and more familiar with this idea that life is probably not a bivalent property. Rather, there's stuff that is today more or less alive in virtue of performing better or worse along some functional dimensions. And I think if indeed the life cutoff doesn't really exist, but it's more a question of continuum, then this is also a good reason to not exclude evolution by natural selection from chemical evolution. So, can we say more about chemical evolution than just something about evolution by natural selection? And I think we can draw further lessons from biology. And to get to these lessons, I'd like to just mention two ways to understand how a population of organisms may evolve. And typically one can think about evolution as either the transformation of a given population of organisms, how this population transforms over time, or a population can also evolve by sampling. You can remove stuff from the population or add stuff to the population. And you can do this in two ways also. You can do this process, have these processes, either depending on the properties of the members. In this case, you would call these processes as acting in a discriminate fashion, or you can have these evolutionary processes work on the population in an indiscriminate fashion, independently of the properties of the organisms in the population. Now, if you do this, if you have this type of dimensions, two dimensions to sort biological processes of biological evolution, of course you'll find natural selection as being a sampling process that acts in a discriminate way. Organisms are sampled, removed from the population typically, because of their properties. But there are other evolutionary processes. Typically, I mentioned drift and migration. These are indiscriminate sampling processes. Biologists have shown also that development processes can play a role. In this case, this is a discriminate transformation process. And you have mutations that are epigenetic stuff that would be indiscriminate transformation processes. Now, if you have this view in mind, the question is, can we do something similar in chemical evolution? Is there room for other evolutionary processes in chemical evolution? We've seen from the debate so far that we've mentioned evolution by natural selection in chemical processes. Could we have more processes, more evolutionary processes? I'd like to mention possibly three. First, there is the question of supramolecular self-organization. It's not just chemical reactions, but it's also using physical forces to typically self-assembly, to do some form of self-assembly. In the case of liposomes, for instance, this is structural self-organization, but we can also have some functional self-organization, as in the case of cross-catalytic networks. And I think this is possibly some form of evolutionary processes also that could be taken into account. Is there drift? Is there chemical drift, random chemical drift? And can this play an explanatory role also in the origins of life? And here I'd like to just mention the models of Freeman Dyson. He made these models that is typically based on pure drift and only drift. So this is a mathematical model, of course, but that could show that random drift could play a role also in origins of life. We could think also about other types of evolutionary processes that would act in an indiscriminate way, like tinkering and the fact that organisms or systems can reuse functions for other purposes or get mixed randomly and associate somehow randomly. If we have this more pluralistic view about prebiotic processes, I mentioned chemical selection, chemical processes and supramolecular self-organization, chemical drift, chemical migration, possibly tinkering, just resorting them according to the same type of two dimensions here can help us understand, I think, that we could also have, like we do have in biological evolution, we could also have in chemical evolution processes of evolution that can be either in form of transformation type processes or sampling processes that could act in a discriminate or an indiscriminate fashion. If we then try to view at the same time chemical evolution and biological evolution, what I'm trying to somehow point to is that we could somehow relate also the way biological evolution works to the way also chemical evolution might have worked, each of which is possibly based on a set of processes that might relate to each other as well. So if we make, in this case here, chemical evolution is at the bottom here. You'll find all the processes I've talked about and corresponding process in biological evolution. So of course, this is work that have been done by biologists. This is, I believe, a way of understanding the different views coming from origins of life studies. For instance, Melvin Cavan will be typically here. Joyce and Duve would be there. People like Diemer would be there. And people like Dyson would be there. So is chemical evolution Darwinian? I'd like to say that it's likely to be, or at least there are good reasons to think that evolution by natural selection might have played a key role here, but it's definitely not just Darwinian. Thank you.